Here's where we are in the governance series. We completed phase 1, seeing the system, letters 1 to 12. We are in phase 2, designing the system, letters 13 to 30. We completed stage 1 through stage 4. We are now in stage 5, preventing regression, letters 24 to 26. We just completed letter 25D, when the scribe leaves. We are in letter 26A, when the organization quietly rewrites itself. By now, you have experienced several structural patterns that quietly reshape an organization. You have seen how silent drift gradually changes the way an organization operates. You have seen how strategic drift slowly separates daily execution from strategic intent. You have seen how decisions become disconnected from their original reasoning until institutional memory begins to disappear. Each of those structural patterns leave something behind. When people can no longer depend upon the organization to accomplish their work, they naturally begin finding another way. That other way becomes today's structural pattern, informal workarounds. As with the previous letters, I would like to invite you into another executive workshop. The events occurred during an engagement with a major airline. As you read, I invite you to step into the workshop. Imagine you are one of the executives responsible for what happens next. The engagement began with what appeared to be a routine executive leadership meeting. Several executives, vice presidents, and directors had gathered to review the current state of the airline's operations. The meeting followed a familiar pattern. Each executive described the activities taking place within their respective organizations. Each department was busy. Each team was working hard. As the discussion continued, however, something unexpected began to emerge. One executive paused and asked a simple question. How much of what we are discussing today is actually moving the airline forward? The conversation shifted. People began looking back through the discussion they had just completed. Nearly every activity described during the meeting involved responding to an existing issue. Operations discussed service disruptions. Customer service described recurring passenger issues. Technology reviewed system outages and application defects. Finance discussed unexpected operational costs. Human resources described staffing challenges. The organization was incredibly busy. Someone finally summarized what everyone had quietly begun realizing. Very little of that effort was creating forward movement. We are spending all of our time fighting fires, not resolving them, simply fighting them. Another executive added, and we're not even getting ahead of the fires. That observation changed the entire discussion. For the first time, the executive team began questioning whether they were dealing with isolated operational issues or whether something much larger was happening throughout the organization. At that moment, the executive team completed the first phase in the executive navigation chart, experience, an event that allows the organization to reveal something that previously remained unnoticed. Nothing about the airline had changed, only what the leadership team now recognized. They had been measuring activity. They had not been measuring progress. That realization carried us to the next step in the executive navigation chart, calibration. Something was different than what they believed. Until that meeting, they believed they were spending their time managing the business. Now they realized they were spending nearly all of their time responding to yesterday's problems. The executive team concluded they had reached the limits of what they could presently explain. They did not need another departmental report. They needed another perspective. One of the vice presidents was asked to engage an outside consultant to determine whether someone looking at the organization from outside the daily operation might recognize something the leadership team could no longer see. That conversation led to a telephone call to me. The VP said to me, "You know how some companies are proactive and others are reactive? We are not even able to be reactive. Like many consulting engagements, the invitation arrived through a familiar door. The door was a request to examine operational challenges. During the first several days, I met with leaders throughout the organization. I reviewed operational activities, observed meetings, listened to discussions. I was taught by one of my mentors there is a very specific way in which to ask questions. Ask in a way that you do not prompt the person for the answer you are looking for. It is similar to not leading a witness in a courtroom. I realize there is an art and a science to this, which means it takes practice. I began with simple questions. How does this process work? How do people know what to do when something unexpected happens? Where is that procedure documented? The answers varied from department to department. Some procedures were part of the organization's official documentation. Others had been documented by the people who created them while responding to a crisis. Some existed as departmental procedures. Others were simply passed from one person to another through experience. Each answer seemed reasonable by itself. Then I asked, how many of these procedures are part of the organization's formally approved operating process? That question moved us into the next phase of the executive navigation chart, recognition. The executive begins understanding what the experience is actually revealing. Until that moment, the discussion had focused on procedures. Now it focused on governance. I asked the executives to consider another question. If I asked 5 different departments to show me the procedure for the same activity, would I receive the same document or 5 different versions? Would I receive the official procedure, the departmental procedure, the emergency procedure, the one everyone actually follows, or the one that exists only because someone once solved a crisis and documented it for their own team? None of those procedures were necessarily wrong. Each had solved a legitimate problem, but together they revealed something much larger. The organization was no longer operating from one shared operating model. It was operating from many. For the first time, the executives began recognizing that they were not simply managing operational complexity. They were managing multiple versions of organizational reality. This is the calibration part of recognition. We need a way to interpret what we have just experienced. We have now reached the name phase of the executive navigation chart. Return to letter 13A and identify the structural pattern that best explains the experience. At that point, we returned to letter 3. We gave this structural pattern a name, informal workarounds. Notice what we did not discover. We did not discover employees refusing to follow procedures. We discovered people creating procedures the organization needed but had never formally adopted. Every workaround solved a local problem. Every workaround made sense to the people using it. Over time, however, those local solutions quietly became unofficial operating models. No single department intended to fragment the organization. Yet collectively, that is exactly what had happened. The executives now understood why they were spending every day fighting fires. They were no longer governing one organization. They were trying to coordinate many independently evolving ones. The discussion changed again. Instead of asking how to eliminate the workarounds, I asked a different question. What is each workaround trying to overcome? One executive answered, our approval process takes too long. Another added, our systems do not communicate with each other. Another commented, we cannot wait for the official process because customers are waiting. Another smiled and admitted, we have always done it this way. Each answer described something different. They realized there is another organizational system quietly governing the enterprise. Every workaround was compensating for another structural pattern. Some compensated for unclear authority. Others compensated for missing information, for slow decision making, for policies that no longer reflected reality. The workaround itself was never the root cause. It was revealing the root cause. The workshop entered another calibration. Now we have language for what we observed. Until that moment, many leaders viewed workarounds as employee behavior. Now they began seeing them as organizational feedback. That distinction changes everything. When leadership sees only behavior, they attempt to change people. When leadership sees structure, they begin improving the organization. Nothing about the employees had changed, only the way leadership interpreted what they were seeing. The next stage in the executive navigation chart is the design. Move from the structural pattern to its design resolution and consult the guidance developed through letters 13B through 23. The design resolution for the structural pattern informal workarounds is designed process authority. It is not writing another policy. It is not sending another email reminding employees to follow the documented process. It is not disciplining people for creating unofficial methods. Those actions address the symptom, not the structure. Calibration in the executive navigation chart states, now we understand what should be intentionally designed or strengthened. This prompts every workaround to trigger a question. What prevented the official process from accomplishing the work? That question moves leadership beneath the workaround. Instead of removing the adaptation, they began repairing the pattern that required the adaptation in the first place. Only then does the workaround naturally disappear, not because leadership prohibited it, because it is no longer needed. That is the difference between correcting behavior and redesigning a system. That brings us to stewardship, the final step in the executive navigation chart. Continue guiding the organization with the river, lighthouse, compass, and navigational chart as the organization continues evolving. A steward learns to see workarounds differently. Every unofficial spreadsheet, undocumented approval, shortcut manual process, and employee says, this is the only way we can get the work done. Instead of asking, why were these workarounds created? They ask, what are these workarounds trying to tell us? Those are not merely operational habits. They are messages. The organization is communicating where its formal design no longer supports the work people have been asked to perform. A steward listens before reacting and becomes curious before becoming corrective. When organizations begin treating workarounds as diagnostic signals rather than disciplinary events, organizations begin seeing a version of themselves they had stopped being able to find in any dashboard or report. Every workaround represents an opportunity to understand the organization more, which brings us to calibration. Stewardship has reached another level of maturity. From this new altitude, relationships that were once hidden become visible, allowing the next stage of the journey to begin with greater clarity and intentionality. In the previous workshop, we discovered that organizations gradually lose knowledge, institutional memory loss, which causes people to begin depending upon individuals rather than systems. Today, we experienced what naturally follows. When people can no longer depend upon the system, they quietly redesign the work for themselves. Those redesigns often solve immediate operational needs. Over time, however, they create another challenge. Every workaround becomes another exception. Every exception eventually becomes another rule. Policies begin accumulating. Documentation expands. Procedures become increasingly difficult to navigate. The organization responds to every new exception by creating another policy. That is where we will go next. In the next workshop, we will experience another structural pattern: policy accumulation. We will discover that organizations rarely become difficult to navigate because they lack policies. More often, they become difficult to navigate because years of well-intentioned policies have accumulated until people can no longer distinguish which ones still serve the organization and which ones now prevent it from moving forward. The goal of governance is not to accumulate more policy. Governance exists to create clarity. When governance creates clarity, people no longer need informal workarounds. Thank you.